Torches flared in the cold night air as Queen Isabella walked into the courtyard, her gown dragging across the wet stones, and the soldiers shifted uneasily under her gaze. She paused near the bound prisoner, her hand trembling yet steadying as she lifted her chin. "Sir Cedric," said, "Your Majesty, the council demands his execution at dawn." She heard the words, but only saw the fear in the prisoner's eyes. A farmer who had stolen bread to feed his children. Her pulse quickened, her heart drumming louder than the rain hitting the helmets of her guards. Lady Eleanor whispered, "If you disobey, they will brand you a traitor." Isabella's jaw tightened as her fingers brushed the hilt of her sword, and she felt the crushing weight of silence pressing on the watching crowd. She raised her voice, trembling but unyielding. "If the crown demands the blood of the innocent, then the crown is already broken." Gasps filled the air, and thunder cracked overhead, signaling the beginning of defiance. At dawn, the council chamber smelled of damp parchment and burning wax as Isabella entered with her steps echoing like a drumbeat. Lord Geoffrey said, "Your words last night spread through the streets like fire." Her silence was more cutting than any blade. She thought of the farmer's eyes and felt every breath sharpen into rebellion. The chamber was crowded with nobles in furs and jewels, their stares heavy with contempt. Lady Eleanor touched Isabella's arm, whispering, "You cannot keep this hidden now." Isabella straightened her shoulders, her voice carrying, "The people suffer while you count your gold. I will not kneel to injustice." Murmurs rippled across the chamber, candles flickering as if the walls themselves recoiled at her defiance. The city streets groaned with unrest as Isabella's decree reached the markets. Sir Cedric rode alongside her carriage, hand on sword, his eyes scanning alleys where whispers grew into chants. A boy's voice cried, "Long live the queen who defies the crown," and others echoed until the square trembled with their voices. Isabella's heart pounded as she raised her hand in acknowledgement, though shadows stirred at the edges. A cloaked figure vanished into the crowd, unseen by most but not by Eleanor, who froze at the sight. She whispered, "There are eyes upon us, Majesty." The cobblestones shook under marching boots as guards tried to contain the swelling tide, but the people pressed forward, tasting rebellion for the first time. In the dim hall of the castle, Isabella stood before the throne she once honored, her fingers tracing its cold surface. She remembered her father's voice declaring, "A crown demands obedience, not mercy." She whispered, "Then let this crown weigh upon me no longer as a chain." Cedric approached, his voice low, "They will brand you a rebel, Isabella." She met his gaze, steel in her eyes, then let them fear what a rebel can awaken. Eleanor stood in the shadows, torn between loyalty to the throne and to her queen. The sound of storm wind rattled the windows, and Isabella placed her palm on the crown, knowing history had already shifted with her defiance. Night returned heavy with dread, the city lit by scattered torches and restless whispers. Isabella stood at the balcony overlooking the square where thousands gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on her. She felt the weight of every life pressing against her chest. Eleanor said, "One word, and they will follow you, but also one word, and they may die." Isabella inhaled the cold night air, her gown fluttering, and she raised her voice. "This kingdom belongs not to tyrants but to those who bleed for its soil." The silence cracked into thunderous cheers. But in the far corner, Cedric noticed a messenger slip through shadows, carrying news that could change everything. The training yard echoed with the clash of steel as Sir Cedric struck down a wooden dummy, his sword splitting the air with controlled fury. Sweat traced lines across his face, though his gaze drifted toward the distant city gates. Isabella entered, her gown dusted by travel, and he stilled his hand immediately. She said, "You see what loyalty to silence has cost our people." Cedric's jaw clenched as he whispered, "Obedience is all I was taught." She stepped closer, her voice sharp yet pleading, "Then learn defiance, for silence now is treason to the living." Cedric looked at her, torn between oaths sworn in blood and the fire in her words, and he lowered his blade, realizing that her rebellion had already claimed him as its soldier. Within the council chamber, nobles argued like crows circling carrion, while Isabella stood silent at the center. Lord Geoffrey slammed his fist on the table, declaring this queen would see us drown in rebellion. Cedric, drawn to her side, spoke for the first time, his voice steady, better rebellion than rot. Gasps broke out as Eleanor's eyes widened in fear, yet Isabella's lips curved into the faintest smile. She placed her hand on Cedric's arm, steadying the storm, and said, "We do not fight for crowns but for the people beneath them." The nobles exchanged glances, their jeweled robes heavy with unease, and the air thickened with the scent of wax and mutiny. The streets burned with tension as armored patrols clashed with peasants who hurled stones and words with equal fury. Cedric rode through the square, his hand gripping his sword, but his eyes betraying conflict. A young woman screamed, "Will you cut us down, soldier, or defend us?" His throat tightened, and he raised his hand to halt the guards. Isabella, standing atop the carriage, shouted, "Your courage is not in killing, but in protecting." Cedric's blade remained sheathed as the people surged with hope, and Eleanor whispered to herself, "He chooses her cause now, whether he admits it or not." The cobblestones echoed with the first cries of unity, louder than the king's decrees. In the torchlit library, Isabella spread parchments across the oak table, maps and letters from villages crying for aid. Cedric leaned forward, his hands braced on the wood, his voice heavy, "We are outnumbered. Majesty and betrayal festers among us." Eleanor paced near the shelves, her voice sharp, "If you fail, the gallows will not wait." Isabella's eyes burned as she replied, "Then let us fail fighting for justice, not living as cowards." The fire crackled, shadows dancing across their faces, and Cedric finally nodded, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. In that moment, the reluctant knight had become her sworn defender, and the rebellion gained its blade. The castle's highest tower overlooked a restless city, smoke rising from distant fires. Cedric stood beside Isabella, the wind tearing at his cloak. He said, "Once I swore to protect the crown, but now I swear to protect you." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the burning streets below, and whispered, "Then protect not me, but the cause we share." Eleanor lingered at the stairwell, her expression torn, her hand pressed against the cold stone. Cedric drew his sword and planted it into the tower floor, his oath sealed in silence. The city roared beneath them, no longer a kingdom of whispers but a furnace of rebellion, and the first light of dawn crept over blood-red clouds. The candlelit chamber grew colder as whispers filled the corners, and Eleanor pressed her hands together, her eyes darting toward the shadowed doorway. A cloaked figure lingered beyond the threshold, his voice low and dangerous. "You were sworn to protect her, yet your silence feeds my cause." Eleanor trembled but whispered back, "I cannot betray Isabella, she trusts me more than anyone." The figure stepped forward, revealing piercing eyes, and said, "Then you choose her over your own life." The weight of his words crushed her, fear weaving itself around her ribs. She whispered, "If I warn her, she will die, and if I stay silent, she will fall anyway." The choice tasted like poison, and betrayal coiled silently in her chest. The council hall was crowded with anxious nobles, their voices rising like a swarm of crows as Isabella entered in crimson defiance. Geoffrey's booming voice silenced them as he declared, "The queen brings unrest, and we bleed for her rebellion." Cedric bristled, his hand drifting to his sword, but Isabella raised her palm, stopping him. She said calmly, "It is not rebellion to demand justice, it is survival." Murmurs rippled, but Eleanor shifted in her seat, her heart heavy with the secret she carried. She thought, "Every word I withhold drives her closer to ruin." Geoffrey's eyes narrowed at Isabella, his smirk dripping with venom as he added, "And survival is not promised to traitors." In the castle corridors, Cedric caught Eleanor's sleeve as she slipped away, his voice harsh, "You are hiding something, tell me now." Her breath hitched as she whispered, "I swore to protect her, but shadows demand my silence." Cedric's eyes burned with fury, and he hissed, "Then your silence may kill her." She looked away, her hands trembling as though bound by chains. Cedric stepped closer, his voice softening, "Eleanor, loyalty cannot live in darkness." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "If I speak, we are all doomed." The torches flickered, throwing jagged shadows against the stone, as the truth weighed heavier than steel between them. The cloaked figure moved through the marketplace with calculated ease, his hand passing coins to merchants who whispered secrets in return. In the shadows, Isabella watched from her carriage, her eyes narrowing as she saw fear ripple across the faces of her people. Cedric muttered, "This serpent poisons every ear, Majesty." Isabella clenched her jaw and said, "Then we must cut the tongue before it coils around us." Eleanor stood nearby, her stomach twisting, knowing the man in the cloak was closer to her than Isabella could imagine. She whispered under her breath, "Forgive me, my queen." The crowd's noise dimmed into a hush as rumors spread faster than wildfire through the city's veins. That night, Isabella stood at the balcony, the wind carrying whispers from the restless streets below. Cedric said, "The people look to you, but shadows coil around us." Isabella placed her hand on the stone rail, her voice firm, "Then I will stand in the light, even if it blinds me." Eleanor stepped forward, her lips parting as if to confess, but her voice broke into silence. In the darkness beyond the walls, the cloaked figure's silhouette watched, his eyes fixed on Isabella with predatory patience. The torches hissed in the night wind, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, knowing the betrayal she held within would soon shatter everything they built. The city square was alive with fury as peasants lifted torches, their chants shaking the stone foundations. Isabella raised her hand, and the roar fell into silence, her crimson gown catching the firelight. She shouted, "Your chains are forged not by fate but by men, and men can be broken." Cedric stood at her side, his sword drawn, scanning the restless crowd as if expecting arrows to fly from the shadows. Eleanor whispered urgently, "The council will brand this treason, Majesty." Isabella's eyes glowed with defiance as she declared, "Let them hear me, for tonight I belong not to the crown but to the people." The flames swayed, and the crowd erupted into thunderous cries of freedom. The palace gates shook under the fists of the gathered crowd, and Cedric barked orders as guards struggled to hold the line. Isabella stood tall upon the balcony, her voice cutting through chaos. "You are not my enemies, you are my blood." The guards faltered, their spears trembling as the chants of the people drowned orders. Eleanor tugged at Isabella's sleeve, hissing, "One word more, and they will storm the gates." Isabella did not flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice like a blade, "If tyranny calls me traitor, then let justice call me queen." The storm of rebellion battered the palace walls, and the kingdom shook with the sound of uprising. Inside the great hall, maps of the kingdom lay scattered as Isabella pressed her palms to the table. Cedric said firmly, "The villages rise, but without steel they will fall." Isabella lifted her head, her eyes blazing. "Then we give them steel, not as subjects, but as soldiers." Eleanor bit her lip, fear twisting her voice. "This path leads to blood, Majesty," Isabella replied, her voice steady. "Blood already flows, but now it shall flow for freedom, not for greed." Cedric unsheathed his sword and drove it into the table, the steel ringing like a vow. The chamber quivered under the weight of a decision that could not be undone. Smoke rose from distant villages as riders galloped through the gates with news of uprisings. Cedric met Isabella on the battlements, his face hard. "The people answer your call, but the king sharpens his blade." Isabella's gown whipped in the wind as she replied, "Then let his blade break against our resolve." Eleanor clutched a parchment in her hand, her voice trembling. "Spies say Geoffrey meets with the crown in secret." Cedric growled, "The viper reveals his fangs at last." Isabella turned toward the horizon where fire lit the sky, and her voice rang like steel. "Then let the flames carry our cry. The kingdom belongs to its people." Night cloaked the castle as drums echoed from beyond the city walls, each beat pounding like a warning in the chest. Isabella stood before her people in the square, torches lighting her face in golden fire. She shouted, "Tonight we cease to beg, tonight we rise to claim what is ours." Cedric raised his sword high, the steel gleaming under the torchlight, his voice a growl. We stand as one. Eleanor stood near, her eyes wet with fear and guilt, the parchment still hidden in her cloak. The crowd roared, their voices shaking the night as rebellion no longer whispered but thundered, a storm none could silence. The great library smelled of dust and wax as Isabella unrolled a faded parchment. Cedric leaned closer, his voice tense. This bears the seal of the crown, hidden for years. Isabella's eyes widened as she read, her breath catching. The boy who carried the message. He is no servant's son but heir to the throne. Eleanor gasped softly, clutching her cloak as though it burned her skin. Cedric growled. A hidden heir means the crown is not what it claims. Isabella whispered, then history itself has lied to us. And his blood is the key. Eleanor's chest tightened, her thoughts screaming, if they know the truth, my silence becomes a blade. Shadows danced, and revelation cracked like thunder between them. In the hidden chapel, candles flickered as Isabella approached the innocent witness, a young boy with trembling hands clutching a wooden cross. She knelt, her voice gentle. Your blood carries a secret that kings have killed to bury. The boy whispered, I never asked for crowns, only to live free. Cedric placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, his tone steady. Freedom demands truth, no matter the cost. Eleanor stood in silence, her throat tight with guilt as her secret unraveled without her words. Isabella's eyes softened, but her voice hardened. Then your silence ends tonight, for the kingdom must know the crown's deception. The boy nodded slowly, and the chapel filled with the weight of destiny. The cloaked figure emerged from the crypt, his voice a whisper that cut like steel. The boy is the blood they fear, the truth they burn. Isabella faced him, her hand steady on her sword. And whose side do you claim, Shadow? His lips curved into a faint smile, the side that keeps him alive. Cedric's eyes narrowed, suspicion burning in his gaze, or the side that seeks to use him as a pawn. The cloaked man bowed slightly, his cloak sweeping across the cold stones. Not pawn, but king. Eleanor's breath trembled as the truth threatened to shatter her resolve. The crypt walls hummed with secrets buried too long. Storm winds battered the tower as Isabella confronted Eleanor, her voice sharp. You knew, and yet you chose silence. Eleanor's hands shook as she cried, if I spoke, they would have killed me. And him. Cedric stepped forward, anger in his voice. Your silence nearly cost us all. Eleanor's tears glistened as she whispered, I betrayed not you, but myself. Isabella's voice softened, but did not break. Betrayal is not silence, it is fear winning over truth. The storm cracked outside, thunder rattling stone walls, as Eleanor fell to her knees, the weight of guilt pressing her into the cold floor. Secrets had broken her, but the queen's cause still burned bright. By dawn, Isabella stood on the castle balcony, the boy beside her, his face pale but resolute. She raised his hand for all to see and shouted, the blood of kings runs not through tyrants but through this child, hidden by lies. Gasps erupted from the crowd as nobles whispered in panic. Cedric raised his sword and declared, the truth has returned to its people. Eleanor stood behind them, her heart torn between shame and relief. The cloaked figure watched from below, his eyes unreadable. The square thundered with voices, the kingdom now divided between crown and truth. The revolution no longer whispered, it roared. The battlefield stretched across rolling fields drenched in fog, drums echoing like thunder through the morning mist. Isabella rode at the front, her crimson gown hidden beneath chainmail, her face set in iron resolve. Cedric marched beside her horse, sword raised, shouting orders as soldiers tightened their lines. From the distant ridge, banners of the crown snapped in the wind, Geoffrey's voice booming, traitors will kneel in blood. Isabella shouted back, her voice carrying across the field, then let the earth drink only tyranny. Eleanor clutched the boy's hand at the rear, praying under her breath. The armies clashed, steel upon steel, and the reckoning began. The clash of steel roared as Cedric swung his blade, cutting down soldiers who pressed too close. Isabella rode into the thick of battle, shouting commands, her voice ringing clear above screams and drums. Geoffrey charged forward with a blade raised high, his eyes burning with fury. He cried, "Your rebellion dies with you." Isabella met his strike with her sword, sparks flying as steel bit against steel. Cedric roared, "Protect the queen," driving enemies back with sheer force. Eleanor pulled the boy into the safety of broken cots, her voice breaking, "Stay hidden, whatever happens." The air stank of smoke and blood, the earth trembling under war's brutal weight. Geoffrey pressed his blade against Isabella's, their eyes locked in hate. He spat, "History remembers only the victor, not the merciful." Isabella pushed back, her voice fierce, "Then let mercy make me immortal." Cedric lunged, forcing Geoffrey back, his shield raised against arrows raining from the ridge. Soldiers fell around them, cries of pain echoing across the field. Eleanor's scream pierced the chaos as enemy riders charged toward the boy. Cedric turned with fire in his eyes, cutting through men like a storm, shouting, "No harm will touch him." The boy crouched low, trembling, clutching the wooden cross tight as hooves thundered near. The battle raged as Geoffrey disarmed Cedric, his blade cutting deep across Cedric's arm. Blood soaked through chainmail, but Cedric roared in defiance, pushing forward. Isabella swung her sword with desperate precision, striking Geoffrey's helm, denting steel but not spirit. Geoffrey sneered, blood at his lips, "You will die as a footnote." Isabella snarled, "No, I will live as a flame." Eleanor dragged the boy into the shelter of toppled shields, her heart racing as arrows hissed past. Cedric staggered but raised his blade again, his eyes burning with unyielding loyalty. The battlefield was no longer just war. It was judgment written in blood. The storm broke with lightning cracking above as Isabella forced Geoffrey to his knees, her blade pressing against his throat. His voice rasped, "Kill me, and you prove yourself no better than I." Isabella's hands trembled, her eyes blazing as Cedric staggered to her side, whispering, "End him, Majesty, before he ends us." Eleanor clutched the boy, her voice shaking. "If she kills him, blood will never stop flowing." Isabella's breath hitched, torn between mercy and justice. The battlefield stilled, soldiers watching, waiting for her choice. She whispered, "Let history decide whether mercy is weakness or strength." The storm roared, and the crown's reckoning hung on her blade. Rain washed across the battlefield as silence fell, broken only by groans of the wounded. Isabella stood over Geoffrey's lifeless form, her sword stained but lowered. Cedric, clutching his wound, whispered, "The crown has fallen, but at a terrible cost." Isabella's breath shook as she looked over the dead, her gown soaked in blood and rain. Eleanor approached with the boy, her voice fragile, "The people await your word." Isabella's eyes burned with sorrow, and she murmured, "Freedom demands sacrifice, and we are its witnesses." Lightning lit the torn banners, fluttering weakly in the wind. The price of victory lay heavy, and silence became the only anthem. In the throne hall, torches sputtered against damp stone as Isabella approached the empty seat of power. Cedric followed with a limp, his face pale, his voice hoarse. "The throne waits for you, Majesty." Isabella paused, her hand brushing the cold crown, resting on velvet. She whispered, "This seat has birthed tyranny in chains." Eleanor said softly, "The people see you as hope, not another tyrant." The boy stood silent, his young face etched with fear of what lay ahead. Isabella turned, her voice clear though heavy, "I do not seek to rule, but to serve the freedom we bled for." The hall trembled with echoes of her vow. In the square below, thousands gathered as Isabella stepped onto the balcony. Rain dripped from her hair as she raised her hand, the boy standing beside her. She shouted, "The throne is no longer the measure of power. The people are the crown." The crowd roared, their torches raised like stars against the storm. Cedric leaned heavily on the stone rail, whispering to Eleanor, "She carries a burden that may break her." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with tears as she whispered back, "But she carries it for us all." The cheers swelled, thunder mixing with human voices, until the night became a hymn of defiance reborn. Later, in a quiet chamber, Cedric sat against the wall, his armor removed, his chest rising raggedly. Isabella knelt beside him, pressing her hand over his wound, her voice breaking, You cannot leave me, not now. Cedric smiled faintly, his lips pale. My oath was to you, and to freedom. I have fulfilled both. Eleanor stood near the window, clutching the boy's shoulders, as the wind howled through cracks in the stone. Isabella whispered, "The kingdom will remember you not as a soldier, but as its shield." Cedric exhaled, his eyes closing, his hand slipping from hers. A silence heavier than war filled the chamber. At dawn, Isabella walked alone through the courtyard, smoke rising from burned banners and shattered gates. She carried a blood-stained parchment in her hand and stopped before a grave freshly dug in wet earth. She placed the parchment gently on the mound, whispering, "Your name will live as long as freedom breathes." Behind her, Eleanor and the boy stood in silence, their faces pale in the gray light. A single crow cawed from the tower, the sound hollow against empty walls. Isabella straightened, her crimson gown heavy with mud, and turned toward the horizon where the sun broke through storm clouds. The revolution was won, but her heart was scarred forever.